Times are changing. And if one doesn't pay attention, one is caught by surprise, unprepared, and overwhelmed by the latest developments. And we all have experienced that, both as individuals and organizationally. Therefore, it's worth the effort to break out from time to time from our limited focus on the present and immediate future and have a look on what might happen a year from now or a decade from now down the line. And this is exactly what we will be doing today. The Red Talk today is about the future. What challenges are the humanitarian community going to face? What are the capacities needed to anticipate and prepare for those challenges? And what could be the implications for the International Federation and our sister organizations? Ross Mountain, today's speaker, is currently Director General of DARA, and I'll let him explain what DARA is, which is it says here what it is.
Please tell.
Please tell, so you have a preview, which is a Madrid-based international foundation specialized in humanitarian and climate change issues. He's also directed the independent review of the UK's Humanitarian Emergency Response approach and capacity. Before that, and that's when I first got to know him personally over many years, he served as a senior UN official with over 36 years' experience in the management of complex humanitarian recovery, development, and peacekeeping operations in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. In his last assignment in the UN, he was responsible for managing the largest electoral operation undertaken by the UN after holding, among other positions, the one of Assistant Emergency Relief Coordinator and Director of the Geneva office of OCHA. So he's very skilled in coordination, in management of large emergencies and recovery operations, and he's served as a special envoy of the UN Secretary General in a number of crises. And knowing Ross over many, many years and having had many arguments and debates with him, one thing he is particularly strong about is he always brings us down to where it all matters, the country level, the vulnerable victims, the real situations on the ground. So he's not just a UN or a humanitarian bureaucrat. He's actually got a lot of experience on the ground, and that I'm sure will be reflected as he speaks to us. He is known for establishing very strategic approaches. In fact, over the time that he's been in the humanitarian system, he has overseen or been part of or shepherded many, many important initiatives and changes that we take for granted now. But I know that when we started on those struggles, there were quite hard battles to be won. So Ross, my old friend, welcome to the Federation. It's a pleasure to have you here today. You are on Red Talk.
I have had the great pleasure of working with the Red Cross in its different incarnations, Red Cross, Red Crescent, in rather a variety of different settings, and of course the Federation as well. And indeed, even in my current incarnation with DARA, and I'm not going to go through a long introduction, that's for sure, but we are delighted to have been collaborating, for example, on the opening chapters of your new World Disaster Report with Randolph Kent of Humanitarian Futures. Indeed, I have with me here a colleague who, in a sense, was almost stolen from the Federation, Philip Tominga, who's been working on that with Randolph. My other colleague, let me just do that. Exhibit A. This is what, that Philip is responsible for, the Humanitarian Response Index. My other colleague who's with me today, wherever he is, Matthew McKinnon, is responsible for this item on climate vulnerability, which we might allude to later on. It's a pleasure to have the chance to be here today, to perhaps share some of the findings that we've picked up over the years, some of the work that DARA has been doing on current and indeed future challenges. I've also been asked to throw out a few challenges to you in the Federation and in the national societies as we look beyond where we are now, not to suggest that we are in the ideal situation where we are now, But we need, as Mukesh has said in his opening remarks, to be looking ahead. The future is, after all, practically upon us anyway. So, let me begin with a few comments on the major threats and challenges facing the world today, ones with direct implications for humanitarian operations. As I mentioned, you'll see a little bit more of this in that chapter on the World Disasters Report, which has been put together with my colleague and the Humanitarian Futures Program. But to cite just a few of them, the global financial crisis will obviously continue to batter both developed and developing countries, and we're seeing that manifested in shrinking aid budgets as well as increased needs both domestically and internationally. As you all will be aware, the target of the Millennium Development Goals to make a real impact on the world is 2015. We're very near that. And poverty-related vulnerability has certainly not been adequately addressed as foreseen when these were launched. Scarcities of water, food around the world, increasing. We look at the drought in East Africa at the present time, which is pushing more and more people, millions indeed, into situations of crisis, and is unfortunately unlikely to get much better in the short or even the medium term. I might say something that should have been anticipated, was anticipated, and was not acted on, despite being anticipated. Health pandemics, these will continue to undermine communities' capacities and countries' economies, despite valiant efforts. HIV/AIDS and other infectious diseases are still major killers, and we've seen with this recent E. coli outbreak in Germany how new disease outbreaks can be extraordinarily disruptive. And of course, our hardy annuals, violence and conflict, disasters that Mother Nature visits on us, and other threats, man-made and technological disasters, including dealing with the risks associated with outdated industrial technologies, for example, as seen in the red sludge in the Danube. So we should spend time thinking about and planning for the humanitarian consequences of these kind of threats, and unfortunately many more. As my colleague Randolph Kent has said, we need to be prepared for the what might be's. We've just been discussing it at lunch and elsewhere that whereas the humanitarian community differs very much from the military, to take a random example, in that the military spend maybe 98% of their time planning, gaming, and maybe 2% of their time operating. With the humanitarians, it's the other way around. If we spend 2% of our time planning, we're too busy, right? And we're too responsive. So I would like to today focus on maybe three major challenges for our organizations, humanitarian organizations. One is the growing politicization of crises and humanitarian aid. Second is increasing needs and vulnerabilities, particularly those due to climate change. And then the issue of shifting demographics and power dynamics. Politicization. The first exhibit I held up, the Humanitarian Response Index, which is an effort to look at how donors are providing humanitarian aid, OECD donors are providing humanitarian aid in crisis countries on the basis of interviews on the ground with national societies, your colleagues, UN agencies, NGOs, and so on. Has this last year come up on the basis of these discussions in some 14 countries with the overriding impression that our humanitarian assistance is being more and more subordinated to other objectives by either host countries or donor countries. One aspect, for example, concerns the militarization of aid, conflicts. I probably don't need to cite examples here. The consequences that has, of course, hits the issue of access, protection, the safety of civilians and humanitarian workers. Donor governments link their support to humanitarian assistance to political or anti-military or anti-terrorism objectives. Afghanistan, Somalia might well be cited. They might prioritize state building and economic development to the detriment of addressing humanitarian needs, or uncritically fund and support recipient governments' agendas, even when state actors are wholly or partly responsible for humanitarian crises, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, Colombia. Sometimes just use aid as an instrument for building goodwill and meeting domestic concerns in their donor country. In some cases, this means the distribution of aid goes to a select group of countries where there is political or media interest, particularly media interest, not based on an objective global assessment of needs, not based on the needs of the vulnerable. Once earlier when I was with OCHA, we did a survey about the quality of consolidated plans, the consolidated action plans, and related funding to that, and funding related to the number of column inches that a particular crisis got. No prizes for guessing which one actually got the better outcome, not the quality of the proposal that was put together. In other cases, it means imposing conditions on aid agencies that restrict their ability to act in accordance with humanitarian principles. As you know, this is not indeed in keeping with the fundamental principle that assistance should be neutral, impartial, and independent of other interests, provided without discrimination and based on needs alone. An interesting dimension of these discussions that we had at the ground level and elsewhere is that most of the humanitarian departments of the government were certainly very well appraised of the basis of good humanitarian donorship, of the principles, and indeed attempt to apply them. But often there are other government departments, ministries, services that unfortunately do intervene with their influence and sometimes, indeed, alas, suborn the aid that is intended only for victims based on need. This is obviously an area that the Red Cross has an interest in and potentially could indeed take a more active and vocal role in preserving the humanitarian space and neutrality for all actors, of course, as well as your own activities. Another kind of politicization, of course, is, but equally of concern, is when many governments and non-state actors themselves try and politicize the process and deny the existence of a humanitarian crisis, misuse discourse around national sovereignty, impose unreasonable restrictions on humanitarian international aid agencies, limit access, and indeed use and abuse civilian populations and access to humanitarian assistance as part of conflict tactics. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these kind of examples. Part of this is due to arguments now of national sovereignty over the humanitarian imperative. And I think we can assume that this will happen more and more often. If we're looking ahead, I think the phenomena of expatriate workers, humanitarian workers, being sort of the first dropped in crises, is likely to decline and perhaps diminish even more than that. How do we deal with this and ensure that crises aren't simply manipulated to serve political, economic, or military objectives? I think the Federation, national societies, and of course very much the ICRC are somewhat more immune perhaps than other actors from these pressures compared to others. But your auxiliary role to governments of national societies can be both a benefit and a disadvantage. It can mean access to affected populations, but on the other hand, it can raise problems of access to affected populations in particular cases. Perhaps here, humanitarian diplomacy can be utilized by the Federation to reinforce the message of the need for independent, impartial humanitarian action. The key is that objectives should always, in my view, be focused on meeting the needs of the affected population. That should surely be the point of departure and the test of how effective we are in what we do. The scale and scope of our disasters, of the disasters that face us, is unfortunately likely to increase. We I think, have noticed that last year that we had faced two mega disasters in Pakistan and Haiti. Pakistan was hit for the fourth time in almost as many years by a major disaster, which was a flood. They had earthquake before and so on. Haiti almost gets it every year. These kind of mega disasters, which frankly the international community didn't do very well on last year, are likely to be more frequent. Yet small to medium disasters are often happening simultaneously, and they will even be more frequent as well. So the potential for us to have to deal with these and a number happening at the same time is unfortunately becoming more and more evident. We had the problem in Japan that you may be aware of, where the earthquake caused the tsunami and the impact there on the nuclear plant. In fact, the nuclear plant was earthquake-proof, but unfortunately, the dispositions they made for the tsunami that resulted from the earthquake has brought in train what we've seen. Now, this is the problem when you see things a little too narrowly. And this is a country that is amongst the very best prepared for dealing with natural disasters. There are a lot of learnings I hope that we will be able to take out of the Japanese sad experience. Already, our system is severely stretched. And the importance, therefore, that we have called for and others have called for governments to invest in building capacity, particularly of local actors, to be able to respond when these things happen, which are beyond the capacity of the international system to deal on its own, is something that I think the Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies should indeed be able to respond to much better than many others. The issue of disaster risk response is not a new one, and yet the investment in it at present remains, frankly, minimal, despite the attention that every now and then is paid to it, and usually in the aftermath of these disasters. But the enthusiasm wanes, unfortunately, or maybe our 2% gets spread a little thin. We need to take a radical shift in attitude and working practices to integrate anticipation, disaster risk, preparedness and resilience into all programs. The UK government recently accepted a number of the recommendations of the review that Mukesh alluded to, that I was involved in, of the Humanitarian Emergency Response review, the core concept of which was building resilience into all of their programs, in their development programs, not just their humanitarian programs in the future. So we might hope that there will be legs to this, so that international donors will perhaps pick up some of these things and support the efforts, for example, that the Federation has been involved in over a number of years and allowed this to be mainstreamed, as it were, at the national level. Let me say a few words about climate change. The monitor I alluded to that we've brought out shows some very disturbing trends around needs and vulnerabilities. We estimate currently there are about 350,000 deaths each year from climate-related issues. An estimated 5 million people will die in the next decade due to this. Many millions more will suffer from illnesses, disabilities, displacement, loss of livelihood, etc. The effects are not just in terms of natural disasters, flooding, extreme weather events, and habitat loss. Indeed, most of the lives are lost in relation to health issues, which is often overlooked. Most of the mortality, indeed, is due to health impacts. And most of these are preventable. Preventable health issues relate to malnutrition, infectious diseases, and are concentrated in a relatively limited number of countries. It's important, perhaps, when we get into the discussion of climate change, so many people think that this is an issue for the future. This is an issue about conference rooms, and hey, it's a comma here, a statement there. I think we're finding that this has real impact now. People are suffering now. Indeed, in essence, what is happening is that the effect of climate, while it's universal, of course, is impacting the most on countries that are already vulnerable. It hits countries and people that are the most vulnerable the hardest. And that's presumably the kind of people we in the humanitarian sector are most concerned about. So it makes life a great deal worse. Today, we've estimated that some 15 countries are acutely vulnerable and suffering these consequences. The numbers will more than triple to 54, as we estimate by the year 2030. We need to focus. We need to prioritize on the most climate vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable countries, and build the resilience that they need for facing some of the consequences of tomorrow. There are ways that the kind of work that can help in these countries that is already, in some cases, being done by national societies, for example, such things as bed net campaigns and so on, that can be scaled up. Maybe this is something that the Federation might be interested in taking further, and indeed some of the national chapters. If I may come on to the issue of shifting dynamics and power dynamics, we have seen how population growth and population movement will affect communities, national governments, and of course the need to respond in these different kinds of challenges that occur when there are disasters hitting these different countries. I could give the example of Niger, which is particularly acutely vulnerable in climate terms, and of course ranks very low in terms of acute malnutrition, with a rate of about 16.7%. If we look forward to 2030, the population is expected to double. And I'm talking about a smaller country. If we start talking about Bangladesh, we talk about many of the other larger countries. How prepared are we to try and deal with the kind of capacities, the kind of challenges that disasters, natural or otherwise, are likely to beset these countries? We've seen, for example, in Haiti, that was a disaster that was much more, which was essentially urban. It's a new dimension in facing up to dealing with challenges. The challenge of how we deal in urban areas is indeed one that's very much before us and will increase in the coming decade. Again, how do we anticipate how humanitarian needs will evolve and the kind of strategies that can be implemented to reduce vulnerability and needs in the future? Much has been said about shifting global political power and the emergence of new players, like new, at least in the international circuit, players like Brazil, China, India, the Gulf states. Clearly, they need to be engaged in a much more strategic way, a much more respectful way, not simply as potential funders, but as actors with fresh insights and approaches on how to address these global challenges. I'm aware that the Federation has some extremely interesting examples of working together, both in networking and indeed discussing philosophy, principles, and approach. And I think some of the examples that you are developing could be more broadly shared. The less has been said about how fragile and unstable the current situation is for the traditional countries, the OECD DAC countries, where the global economic crisis has affected the political dynamics of many of these. And many governments that have traditionally been strong supporters of humanitarian action have changed, and there are new political actors on the scene who are not as familiar with humanitarian work. And indeed, those actors in the OECD countries need to be better informed, may I say educated, on why maintaining humanitarian principles is important. Humanitarian principles are an article of our faith, if you will, but the basis is not really ideological. The basis is because that is how we can be most effective in reaching the vulnerable. It is justifiable in terms of how it allows us to operate and how it allows those who would work in this field to be effective. Sometimes it becomes a flag, which sometimes becomes a red flag when it's not justified in terms of why we are doing this. I needn't go into the aid cutbacks. There are some notable exceptions of countries that are not cutting back at the moment. The UK, Australia, Sweden, but there are increased pressures on humanitarian organizations to find sustainable funding, which means we need to demonstrate the results and impact of our work. Also new competition. I mentioned earlier that sort of Western aid workers are likely to be less evident on the scene. You're now seeing much more of this being subcontracted to private sector organizations on a commercial basis, being the growth of and involvement of foundations and others who don't work normally under our overall umbrella. There are new power dynamics in that sector. Therefore, new challenges of coordination, ensuring quality and effectiveness and learning and so on. And it means that we need to continue learning from innovation and good practices. But innovation, we need to look ahead. We need to be willing to try new ideas and apply new ideas as well. If I may just conclude with a few reflections, perhaps on some implications for the Federation. The basic question, I guess, not just for the Federation, but for the sector as a whole, is: are we prepared for the future? I would like to hope. We'd all like to hope the answer is yes, but I think that would be whistling in the dark. Even with the very useful strategy of the Federation of 2020, clearly it cannot deal or has not been able to deal with all the trends that have been spelt out or addressed in the kind of strategy that is being put forward, and indeed looking to the future challenges. This is not by any manner of means a criticism of the Federation. Indeed, the vast majority of humanitarian organizations, certainly including the UN, donor agencies, and even development actors, have inadequately looked ahead to seeing how the capacity can be developed. I mentioned earlier this Humanitarian Emergency Response Review. Without going into the chapter and verse on this, it's focused on some half a dozen major areas: anticipation, resilience, leadership, innovation, accountability and impact and accountability, particularly to the host populations, partnerships, and preserving humanitarian space. What's been interesting about this is that it has been indeed now endorsed almost in its entirety, the recommendations, by the current government. And it seems to have legs in terms of international influence, because there's a lot of interest being shown by other major donors, essentially in the OECD countries, but in fact even further afield. There are a number of these headings that perhaps might well be taken into review as you develop your programs going forward. You are already working on many of these same issues, and indeed, maybe that's a source also of additional support. As I say, I do expect that this will have implications with other donors across the sector. As we move ahead to 2020, there may be four areas that I would perhaps wish to specify that the Federation and national societies might make a particular difference in minimizing the effect of these trends. One is intensifying your work in the area of disaster risk reduction and community resilience. A second would be scaling up your work in addressing climate-related vulnerability. A third, reaching out and forging stronger partnerships with other humanitarian actors, particularly on the ground in affected countries. And leveraging your humanitarian diplomacy efforts to shift attitudes and perceptions about these global challenges and how to address them. On the first point, the risk reduction, community resilience, you have, as a federation with many national societies, have long been a leader in this field and an advocate in this field. Perhaps there might be more done in terms of scaling up and expanding the focus from natural and environmental risks to a more comprehensive approach. We have found in a work that we did in Central America, that we will now be taking forward in West Africa, that governance issues, poverty or land use regulations often have much more impact than physical issues and disaster risk reduction. And obviously such involvement in such fields requires actors to be more deeply engaged in longer-term processes that aim at reducing vulnerability, not a quick fix. And it therefore means addressing the political and socioeconomic dimensions of risk and vulnerability. Again, perhaps this is an area that your humanitarian diplomacy can be strengthened, where you might be more present in many of the risk reduction debates and using the influence that you obviously have to move ahead in that field. In the climate area, the advocacy that has gone on in Copenhagen and Cancun is important, but it's perhaps more in terms of building resilience and reducing vulnerability to the additional threats caused by climate change at the community level, where a major attention could be directed. And utilizing the strength that you have at the national level and across the world. Here I really believe the Federation could have a real leadership role with other humanitarian actors. I mentioned earlier, why not see a more massive campaign like your malaria bed net distribution campaign to scale up and roll out some of these sort of more cost-effective of measures. And indeed, again, advocacy for policy-level changes, drawing on your direct field-level experience would be extremely useful. Partnerships. In our own research, and indeed in that of others, we have consistently heard good things when we visit the countries in crisis that the Red Cross is doing, including, especially in places like Somalia or Colombia. But another comment we frequently hear is that the movement does not link up enough with other actors and coordinate as well as it might, not just with the UN, but including with the UN. It sometimes seems like there are two parallel systems cooperating and not necessarily complementing each other. I repeat that coordination is not about simply making friends. It's about combining efforts for the results that are required in a country by the vulnerable people. And I would like to hope that more could be done to build that up. While maintaining your independence, which is obviously important, bringing together the different resources to alleviate better humanitarian suffering shouldn't present, your independence shouldn't prevent obstacles for close collaboration. I've touched on humanitarian diplomacy. Many of these issues are ones where the Red Cross is already engaged, but might perhaps be more strongly engaged in both the public and private arena. You have a particularly privileged position in terms of credibility, experience, global reach. And this doesn't mean that you need to go public or political, indeed, on every issue, but the fundamental principles that the movement defends needs to be defended, deserves to be defended, and sometimes vigorously. Politicization, perhaps, may be one such area which needs more work to be done to raise awareness and help donor governments understand that that is not the best way to help supporting those who are most vulnerable. In conclusion, I'd like to make a plea that the Federation and its network prepares for the future. As I said before, it is upon us now. That it anticipates and maps future vulnerabilities, focusing on chronically vulnerable populations and plan on how to reduce them. You might also focus on building resilience of communities and organizational capacities to deal with these challenges, including for unanticipated challenges. Promote strategic leadership, including within the movement, and encourage networks working together with others in a way that actually maximizes results. Ensure, finally, semi-finally, that our responses are based on needs and not on politics. That surely should be the touchstone of our interventions. In my view, at least, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is extremely well placed to deliver on these points. Those who we serve need us to be even better at what we do now. Thank you.
I was particularly struck when you asked the question, why are humanitarian principles important? It seemed to me that for a lifelong humanitarian to ask that obvious question, I think says it all in terms of both the challenges we face, as well as the kind of world we live in where those principles are under threat. Your clear prescription at the end of what we should do more of as a Red Cross, Red Crescent movement was very clear. I think also that your three key points, which were about the subordination of humanitarian objectives to other ends, the reminding us of the scale and scope of crisis, and asking whether or not the sophistication of our response is being scaled up in equal measure to those increased complexities. I think those are very good points, as well as pointing out what the world expects in terms of anticipation, leadership, impact, accountability, and humanitarian space. So there are many issues on which we can reverberate. I know there are at least 200 plus people down the line, maybe more by now, and that this room is full. We've got about 12 to 13 minutes, and we should go straight ahead.
There's a question from Alex, who's working for the Swiss Red Cross in Bangladesh, and he would like to know, as long as natural resources are not equitably distributed, vulnerability of the people will continue to exist. Do you share this view? And if so, how can we address this issue?
The issue of natural resources, I mean, we're standing in Switzerland, which is not exactly replete with many natural resources. Cuckoo clocks, I'm not sure, would be classified as one of those natural resources. So the international community certainly should pay particular attention to those who are less endowed and less equipped. Again, it's not a big mystery about which countries are especially vulnerable. They can be mapped, charted on past performance and so on, and let's focus on them.
Another question from Nan Bouzard from the American Red Cross. In a world of huge operational complexity, widely differing accounting practices and varying measures of success, how do we get a clearer definition of value for money, which is emphasized in the 2 recent UK reviews on emergency aid and multilateral partnerships?
What we tried to do in the HER report in the UK is say, yeah, value for who of money? It's not just a question of value for money for a taxpayer, but presumably the taxpayer who provides the money gets maximum value when it is the most effective for the people on the ground. After all, that's why we're doing it, no? And so we were focusing very much, and if, you know, you can't do unit costs for, I used to be in the Congo, for delivery of support in Kinshasa or in Ituri. Value for money is a relative term, and it's about effectiveness. But there are ways of finding out which organizations are more effective. You keep a track record of what they've done in the past, what it's cost. And therefore, in future, you know who are better channels of doing that. So the value for money is an issue, I think, about impact. Frankly, I think we should all be about impact.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, because there was just a review that was actually published, I believe, last week that said that much of the progress in the development goals was actually made in the more progressive developing countries and not the LDCs or least developed countries. So my question is, how do you promote disaster management before a crisis in areas where there's such other dire needs, especially in least developed countries when there's starvation and other humanitarian issues that might have kind of a priority to having financial support over long-term protection? Thank you.
On the MDGs, a very, very fair question. What we've been advocating, I think, is that disaster risk reduction is not an immediate humanitarian charge. It should be something that is built into the development programs. So it's not about taking money away from food aid that is required for very vulnerable groups. It is about using the funds that are available for development. Indeed, that's what seems to have been accepted of our advocacy in the UK, that in vulnerable countries, those programs, these are government aid programs, but presumably combined with national government programs, should be focused on building that up. It's in their interest. If you're in a country that's likely to be hit by a cyclone or drought, then surely that's worth investing in, so that you don't have to worry about all the extensive money that's subsequently required for responding.
My name is Amir Ahmed. I work as a consultant for IFRC on research. And my question is related to not recently, I mean for a while now, we have been advocating for engaging the locals, including governments and civil society organizations, but at the same time we understand for delivering better and effective aid, but at the same time we understand that corruption is widespread, and probably in the most vulnerable countries as well. And I'm just trying to think about how this reconciles or conflicts with this concept of the politicization of aid or depoliticization of aid. In your future view, do you think that we still need to deal with these countries? Also, they have corrupt regimes, or what is the alternative?
To the issue of, I mean, corruption, you could argue that politicization is corruption too, by other people that aren't usually accused of corruption. I mean, corruption, it takes two hands to clap, you know. But clearly, in countries which there are, where the government is, mechanisms are often civ-like, one needs to find means, particularly on the humanitarian delivery, of getting to the population. And then certainly one should not cut off assistance to those in need in countries just because of what their government may or may not be capable of doing. I think there's a question, for me anyway, my concern on the humanitarian side is I frankly don't care what mechanisms work as long as you get to the population quickly. When you start talking about transition development things, then you have to bring the government in. There's no reason why the government shouldn't be involved if they have the mechanisms to deliver on the humanitarian stage. But that's a judgment call on the ground, and you try and choose the mechanisms that are appropriate in order to meet your primary objective, which is assistance to those in urgent need.
You mentioned at the outset that the military were spending 98% of their time on planning and humanitarians 2%. That led me to think that then humanitarians are probably more successful with their humanitarian operations percentage-wise than the military with military operations. But that also led me to want to ask the question of IFRC, to what extent Mukesh, for example, representing IFRC here, would consider that that is a fact. I should think that on the whole, organizations spend more than 2% if you think of the learning, if you think of building capacity at the community, national, regional levels, etc. That is, in fact, one of the bases of good response. But my question is somewhat different, and that is, in 2020 and beyond, how do you, Ross, see that one would be, as humanitarians, collaborating more closely with the military? If you see what the developments have been on that score in the last 10, 15 years, and the role that the military have increasingly played, I think back of the tsunami, but also of Pakistan earthquake and other such operations, where even as recently as this, on the Libya-Tunisia border, if you look at the collaboration between the Tunisian military and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, it's been rather good. So how do you see that in 2020 and beyond, the role of the military in humanitarian operations, bearing in mind, of course, that you don't want to muddy the waters? Thank you.
But the serious question about the military, and I think, again, one of the facts are that the domestic military in many countries are an indispensable part of many responses, emergency responses. Right? If we look at Pakistan after the floods, their presence, their capacity to mobilize, and so on. In life and in humanitarian action, there are upsides and downsides. You weigh the upside in the circumstance and you minimize the downside. Clearly, the military weren't particularly good at getting into areas that were run by groups, by the Taliban groups, for example, in Pakistan. So it's horses for courses, but they are very much, and they will increasingly be in many vulnerable countries, a mechanism whereby the government is able to provide support to its population readily. I think many of us would prefer that to be the National Red Cross, Red Crescent Society. And they can work together. I mean, it depends very much on the circumstances. But the importance, we've always recognized that the military is a last resort. And it should be a last resort, where particularly the foreign military. So I do see governments that are concerned about the sovereignty issue increasingly using their domestic military more. I think it's very important that the ICRC and the Red Cross imbues them with an understanding of what humanitarian assistance is. They should be seen where this does happen as supportive of the action, not replacing those that can do it, like National Red Cross societies where they are capable. But the primary goal of what we do on the humanitarian side is make sure assistance gets to people who need it. And that's why even from the beginning, even with international military forces, we have recognized the last resort dimension. But I think the last resort is going to be increasingly domestic, not international.
There's a question from David Lynch, who works for the IFRC in Budapest. There's a call for increased partnership at international level when the international approach is increasingly constrained. Have we not underestimated the power of partnerships established by national societies at local and national level, which can be leveraged?
I would certainly hope that the delegations of the Federation on the ground, but even more the national societies, will collaborate with the advantages that they have and can bring in terms of getting into local communities and being present in so many cases across affected countries, and help not only in the response side, but also building up the resilience capacity of communities to be able to deal with the responses before support is available, if ever, internationally, but even more coming from capitals.
Ross, thank you very much for your thoughtful words. I think you have held a mirror up to all of us, including yourself, as members of the humanitarian community, raised many questions. I think established a basis on which we may wish to invite you again to tell us what the answers are in the future as well. And without more ado, I think we'd like to express our appreciation to you for coming to this Red Talk.
So, thank you, Ross. It's been a very interesting presentation. I believe that I am speaking for everyone here and also online when I present to you our gratitude. We have been talking about the future today, but we also have roots, we have history, we have home, and this is the home of the Red Cross. Thank you, Ross, very much.
Thank you all very much. Good luck.